Welcome to our deep dive, into the world of the Jesuits.
Okay.
We're going to be exploring some excerpts from their Wikipedia article.
Right.
And trust me, it's a wild ride.
It is.
The Jesuits are this fascinating mix of, piety and scholarship and global influence.
Mm-hmm.
But they've also been at the center of some major controversies throughout history.
For sure.
So get ready to unpack centuries of religious fervor and political intrigue and intellectual debate
Yeah.
as we try to understand who the Jesuits are,
Right.
where they came from, and the impact they've had on the world.
Yeah. What's so captivating about them is how their story intertwines with major historical currents.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, global exploration, colonialism.
That's a lot.
They were right there in the mix of it all,
Yeah.
shaping and being shaped by these monumental shifts in history.
And it all begins with this larger-than-life figure,
Yeah.
Ignatius of Loyola.
Ignatius.
He wasn't your typical religious founder.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about a Spanish nobleman,
Mm-hmm.
a soldier who got caught in the crossfire of battle.
Yes. The Battle of Pamplona in 1521.
Pamplona.
A cannonball shattered his leg.
Oh, wow.
It was during his long and painful recovery that he experienced a profound spiritual awakening.
It's like something out of a movie, right?
I know.
He's bedridden, grappling with his injuries,
Mhm.
and suddenly he starts having these intense mystical experiences.
Yeah.
And this leads him to write the spiritual exercises,
Right.
this guidebook for spiritual growth that becomes a cornerstone for the Jesuits.
The spiritual exercises encourage self-reflection,
Okay.
deep meditation, and discerning God's will in everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
It was a deeply personal and transformative journey for Ignatius.
Yeah.
And it laid the groundwork for the kind of spirituality he wanted to share with others.
So picture this Ignatius still recovering, heads off to study in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
It's there that he gathers 6 companions,
Right.
and they decide to form a new religious order. And here's where things get audacious.
All right.
They call themselves the Society of Jesus.
You can imagine the ripples this caused.
Oh, that.
Other religious orders saw it as presumptuous,
Uh-huh.
even blasphemous.
Wow.
Who were they to claim such a direct connection to Jesus himself?
Seriously, you'd think they might have opted for something a little more humble at first, right? But Ignatius and his companions weren't interested in blending in.
No?
They had a grand vision
Yeah.
to serve God and the church with unwavering dedication.
Mm-hmm.
The name Society of Jesus was a bold statement reflecting their ambition and zeal.
It was a statement that resonated with Pope Paul III.
Okay.
Despite the initial controversy, he officially recognized the Jesuit order in 1540.
So he was on board.
Yeah.
And from that point on, their growth was astonishing.
It was.
They just took off.
Yeah.
We're talking 74 colleges established within just 16 years of their founding.
Wow.
They were popping up all over Europe, Asia, and even the Americas.
That's amazing.
That's a level of expansion most organizations can only dream of.
And their approach to education was revolutionary.
How so?
They embraced humanism, the core of the Renaissance.
Okay.
And they saw no contradiction between faith and reason.
Interesting.
So you'd find their colleges teaching the classics alongside mathematics, science,
Wow.
and even non-European languages.
That's forward thinking.
I know, right?
So they were shaping young minds and contributing to the scientific revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But the Jesuits weren't just about classrooms and libraries.
Right.
They were hardcore missionaries determined to spread their faith to every corner of the globe.
Yeah.
And that takes us to their global missions, which are filled with both triumphs and controversies.
Let's start with China.
Okay.
Imagine Jesuit missionaries bringing Western science and astronomy to the Ming Dynasty court. They were presenting European knowledge and technology, even building intricate clocks that fascinated the emperor.
It's like a cultural exchange program.
It-
But their efforts in China weren't without challenges.
No.
There was that whole Chinese rights controversy.
Yes. The Jesuits tried to adapt Christianity to Chinese culture,
Okay.
allowing converts to continue practices like ancestor veneration.
Interesting.
They argued it was a matter of cultural respect
Right.
and wouldn't compromise their faith.
I see.
But this sparked intense debate about the boundaries of Christian orthodoxy.
So, like, where do you draw the line?
Exactly.
It sounds like the Jesuits were walking a tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to find that balance between respecting local traditions and upholding the doctrines of the church.
They were.
But this tension between adaptation and orthodoxy would become a recurring theme in their story.
Absolutely. And in the case of China, it ultimately led to their expulsion in the 18th century.
Wow.
It's a reminder of how cultural differences and religious interpretations can clash.
Yeah, even with the best of intentions.
Exactly.
Their mission in Japan followed a similar trajectory. They enjoyed early success, even being granted a feudal domain in Nagasaki for a while.
That's impressive.
But ultimately, the ruling powers grew wary of their influence and clamped down, fearing they were becoming a threat to Japanese society.
It seems power dynamics and suspicion of foreign influence were recurring obstacles for the Jesuits.
Yeah, it keeps coming up.
Now shifting focus to Latin America,
Okay.
we see an even more complex and controversial chapter in their story.
Yeah, their involvement in the Americas is particularly interesting because it raises questions about colonialism and religious conversion and the impact of European culture on indigenous populations.
It does.
They established these settlements called reductions, which were essentially self-governing indigenous Christian communities.
Right.
It almost sounds utopian.
Yeah.
But I bet it wasn't that straightforward.
You're right to be skeptical.
Okay.
While the Jesuits often aimed to protect indigenous people from the brutality of Spanish colonists, the reductions involved a significant degree of cultural imposition.
Right.
They were bringing European values and ways of life into these communities, whether or not they were welcomed.
So it highlights that tension again, right?
It does.
The good intentions clashing with the realities of power and cultural difference.
Yeah.
They might have genuinely wanted to help the indigenous population, but they were still operating within a colonial system that was inherently exploitative.
Exactly. And it's this tension that lies at the heart of many debates about the Jesuits' impact, especially in Latin America.
Right.
Their actions, even when well-intentioned, were often inseparable from the larger forces of colonialism and cultural assimilation.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here.
Yeah.
The Jesuits pushing boundaries, navigating complex cultural landscapes, and often facing pushback from both within and outside the church.
Right.
But before we delve into their ultimate suppression and eventual comeback, let's zoom in on one specific area in South America, Paraguay, and the Guarani missions.
Right.
What was happening there?
The Guarani missions are particularly fascinating because they embody the conflicting narratives that surround the Jesuits. Some historians see them as remarkable examples of social engineering, creating these relatively self-sufficient communities where the Guaranis were protected from exploitation and taught valuable skills.
So almost like a model society.
Right. It's almost presented as a model of social harmony and cultural exchange.
Right. I've even heard people describe it as a sort of Jesuit utopia.
I have too.
But obviously there's another side of the story.
Absolutely. Critics point out that this so-called utopia was built on the suppression of indigenous traditions and the imposition of a rigid religious and social order. The Guaranis weren't exactly given a choice in the matter.
Right.
The Jesuits controlled their labor, their spiritual life, and essentially every aspect of their existence.
And it makes you wonder about the true nature of power, right?
Yeah.
Even when exercised with seemingly good intentions, there's always a risk of control and manipulation.
There is.
And it seems like the Guarani missions were a prime example of that.
They were, and it wasn't just a theoretical debate.
Okay.
There were uprisings and revolts within the missions. Indicating that many Guarani chafed under Jesuit rule.
So it wasn't all peace and harmony.
It wasn't.
It shatters that image of a harmonious utopia.
It does.
And reveals the underlying tensions and power struggles.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that even in what appeared to be their most successful mission, there were cracks in the facade.
There were.
So with all this controversy swirling around them, this constant push and pull between adapting to local cultures and maintaining their own doctrines, it's probably no surprise that the Jesuits eventually faced a serious reckoning.
Yeah, that reckoning began in the mid-18th century, with various countries starting to expel the Jesuits.
Interesting.
This wave of suppression culminated in a dramatic decision by Pope Clement XIV in 1773. The complete abolishment of the Jesuit order.
It's mind-boggling to think about a religious order as powerful and far-reaching as the Jesuits being shut down just like that.
I know.
What were the main factors that led to their downfall?
It was a perfect storm, really.
Like what all came together?
Accusations of political meddling, their economic influence, resentment from other religious orders, and those persistent Chinese rights controversies.
Yeah, we talked about that.
It all came crashing down on them.
Plus, let's not forget the backdrop of the Enlightenment.
Oh, Right.
It was a period of intellectual upheaval, with traditional authority being questioned left and right.
Yeah.
And the Jesuits, with their global reach and intellectual prowess, became a target for those who saw them as a threat to the changing political and intellectual landscape.
Precisely. They represented the old order, the power of the church, in a world that was increasingly embracing secularism and individual liberty.
I see.
Their suppression was a symbolic victory for those who sought to diminish the church's influence.
As we know, the story doesn't end there.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
The Jesuits didn't just vanish into the mists of history.
Not at all. And that's what makes their story so remarkable.
Yeah.
Even in the face of suppression, they found a way to persevere.
So they didn't just give up.
No, they didn't.
One particularly fascinating example is Catherine the Great of Russia.
Oh, yeah.
She defied the Pope's decree.
Wow.
And allowed them to continue operating within her empire.
That was a bold move.
It suggests that even in a time when the Jesuits were seen as dangerous and subversive, some rulers recognized their value. Perhaps Catherine saw their educational and administrative skills as assets to her empire.
It's certainly possible, and her decision would have a lasting impact.
Oh, so...
When Pope Pius VII restored the Jesuit order in 1814.
Okay, so they come back.
Yeah, after more than 40 years of suppression.
Wow.
They were able to draw on their experience in Russia to help rebuild their networks and institutions.
So after being officially silenced for decades,
Right.
they were back in action.
And their resurgence, their ability to adapt and rebuild, is a testament to their resilience and their commitment to their mission.
It really is.
But they were returning to a world that had undergone significant changes.
That's right. The 19th century was a time of industrialization, nationalism, and new social movements.
A lot was happening.
Yeah, the Jesuits would have to navigate this rapidly evolving landscape while grappling with their own internal debates and the legacy of their controversial past.
And that brings us to the 20th century.
All right.
A period marked by global conflicts, ideological clashes, and profound social transformations.
Yeah.
One of the key developments in the 20th century is the emergence of liberation theology, particularly in Latin America. It's a movement that emphasizes social justice, economic equality, and the church's role in fighting oppression. I know the Jesuits were deeply involved in this movement, but it also caused some friction within the church, right?
Yes, liberation theology really shook things up. It emerged from the lived experiences of priests and theologians working in impoverished communities. They were witnessing firsthand the devastating effects of poverty, inequality, and political repression. And they felt that the church needed to respond more forcefully to these injustices.
It sounds like they were trying to make faith relevant to the struggles of everyday people, connecting the gospel message to the fight for social and economic justice.
Exactly. And many Jesuits in Latin America embraced liberation theology wholeheartedly. They saw it as a way to live out their commitment to social justice and to stand in solidarity with the poor and marginalized. They organized communities, spoke out against injustice, and even challenged the political and economic structures that perpetuated poverty and oppression.
But this activism didn't sit well with everyone in the church, did it?
No, it created a deep division within the church. Some saw liberation theology as a dangerous departure from traditional doctrine, accusing it of being too closely aligned with Marxist ideas. They worried it was more about social revolution than spiritual salvation.
So you had this clash between those who saw the church's mission as primarily spiritual, focused on individual salvation, and those who believed the church had a moral obligation to address social and economic injustice. And the Jesuits were right in the middle of this ideological battleground.
They were. And it put them in a difficult position. They were loyal to the church and the Pope, but they also felt a deep commitment to the principles of liberation theology. It was a time of intense debate, internal struggle, and even accusations of disloyalty from both sides.
It sounds like a real test of their values and their commitment to both faith and justice. How did the church hierarchy respond to this growing liberation theology movement?
Pope John Paul II, while sympathetic to the plight of the poor, became increasingly critical of liberation theology. He saw it as a distortion of the gospel message and a threat to the church's unity. He believed the church's primary mission was spiritual, not political, and that engaging in class struggle was a distraction from its core teachings.
So the Jesuits found themselves caught between their commitment to social justice and their loyalty to the Pope. It must have been a difficult position to navigate.
It was a period of intense internal conflict for the order. And the tension came to a head in the early 1980s when Superior General Pedro Arrupe suffered a debilitating stroke. Pope John Paul II, concerned about the direction of the order and its perceived alignment with liberation theology, took the unprecedented step of appointing his own personal delegate to oversee the Jesuits.
That's a pretty dramatic move. It shows how seriously the Pope viewed the situation and his determination to rein in what he saw as a straying from the Church's true path. It was a clear message that he wouldn't tolerate dissent, even from a powerful and influential order like the Jesuits.
Exactly. It was a significant power play and a clear indication that the Jesuits were on thin ice. It highlighted the limits of their autonomy within the Church and the risks they faced when challenging the established order.
So the Jesuits were facing internal divisions and pressure from the Vatican, but they were also dealing with the turbulent realities of the outside world, particularly in Latin America, where many were actively involved in social justice movements. And tragically, this commitment to justice came at a high price for some.
You're referring to the horrific murders of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter in El Salvador in 1989. It was a brutal act that sent shockwaves through the Jesuit community and the world.
It's a heartbreaking reminder of the dangers that those who challenge power and speak out for justice often face. Can you tell us more about the context of these murders, what was happening in El Salvador at the time?
El Salvador in the 1980s was engulfed in a brutal civil war, a conflict marked by human rights abuses and extreme violence. The Jesuits at the University of Central America in San Salvador were outspoken critics of the government and the military's actions. They advocated for peace, human rights, and a negotiated settlement to the conflict.
So they were targeted for their activism, for their willingness to speak truth to power. They were seen as a threat by those who wanted to maintain the status quo, even if that status quo was built on violence and oppression.
Exactly. Their murders were a deliberate attempt to silence those who dared to challenge the ruling powers. It was a chilling reminder that the pursuit of justice often comes at a great personal cost.
Did their deaths have any lasting impact on the Jesuit community or on the situation in El Salvador?
Absolutely. The murders sparked international outrage and condemnation. They became a rallying point for those who supported the Jesuits' peace and justice work. It galvanized the movement for peace in El Salvador and contributed to the eventual peace accords that ended the Civil War.
Their sacrifice, as tragic as it was, helped to bring about the very peace and justice they had dedicated their lives to. It's a powerful reminder of the impact that even a few individuals can have when they stand up for what they believe in, even in the face of danger.
Their legacy continues to inspire Jesuits and others working for social justice around the world. They're remembered as martyrs for the cause of peace and a testament to the Jesuit commitment to walking with the poor and marginalized, even when it means putting their own lives at risk.
So we've seen how the Jesuits in the 20th century faced internal divisions, external pressures, and even violence. But it wasn't all darkness and conflict. There were also signs of renewal and adaptation, weren't there?
Yes, despite the challenges, the Jesuits also experienced growth and renewal in the 20th century. They continued to expand their educational institutions, particularly in underserved communities. They became increasingly involved in interfaith dialogue, recognizing the importance of building bridges between different religious traditions. And they began to focus more on environmental issues, seeing the care for creation as an integral part of their mission.
It sounds like they were trying to respond to the changing needs of the world and to find new ways to live out their faith in a rapidly evolving context.
Exactly. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s had a profound impact on the Jesuits. The council encouraged the Church to engage more deeply with the modern world and to address the challenges of contemporary society. This call to action resonated deeply with the Jesuit commitment to finding God in all things and to serving others.
It seems like the Jesuits were trying to find that balance again, staying true to their core values while also adapting to the changing times and engaging with the world in new ways.
Yes, and this ongoing process of adaptation and renewal would eventually lead to a remarkable development. The election of the first Jesuit Pope Francis in 2013 was a watershed moment for the order and for the Catholic Church as a whole.
It was a surprising choice, wasn't it? He wasn't exactly a household name before his election. What was it about Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio, as he was known then, that made him stand out?
Well, long before he became Pope Francis, he was known for his humility, his simple lifestyle, and his deep concern for the poor and marginalized. He lived in a modest apartment, took public transportation, and often spent time ministering to those living in the slums of Buenos Aires.
It sounds like he embodies the Jesuit ideal of finding God in all things, especially in the service of others.
That's a great way to put it. And his papacy has been marked by a focus on mercy, compassion, and dialogue. He's challenged the Church to be more welcoming and inclusive, to reach out to those on the margins of society, and to prioritize the needs of the poor and the planet.
It's interesting how many of the themes we've been discussing, the commitment to social justice, the tension between adaptation and tradition, the emphasis on finding God in the world, they're all reflected in Pope Francis's papacy.
Absolutely. His election has brought a renewed focus on the Jesuit way of thinking and acting in the world. It sparked a conversation about the role of the Church in the 21st century and the need to address the challenges facing humanity with both compassion and courage.
So the Jesuits, after centuries of navigating complex cultural landscapes, facing suppression, and experiencing internal divisions, find themselves in a unique position. One of their own is now the leader of the Catholic Church, bringing their perspective and values to the global stage. It's a remarkable turn of events.
It is. And it raises fascinating questions about the future of the order and their role in shaping the Church and the world in the years to come.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the world of the Jesuits. From their origins in 16th century Spain to their global missions, their suppression and restoration, and their ongoing efforts to adapt to the changing world, it's been quite a journey.
And through it all, we've seen how their story reflects the broader historical currents, the complexities of cultural encounter, and the enduring human search for meaning and purpose.
But before we wrap up, let's turn our attention to you, our listener. We've explored the multifaceted history of the Jesuits, their triumphs and their failures, their controversies and their contributions. Now we want to leave you with a final thought-provoking question.
Knowing what you now know about the Jesuits' complex and often controversial history, what do you think is their most significant legacy, for better or for worse? It's a question with no easy answer, but one that's worth pondering.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the Jesuits. We hope you've come away with a deeper understanding of this remarkable and enigmatic order and the enduring questions they raise about faith, power, and our shared human story. We've journeyed through centuries with them, from their fiery beginnings to their suppression and resurgence, all the way to a Jesuit pope leading the modern Catholic Church.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride through history, hasn't it?
It really has, and I think what strikes me most is how even with all this information, there's no simple Jesuit box to put them in.
Right.
They've been scholars and missionaries, educators and activists, and they've been both praised and vilified for their actions throughout history.
Exactly. It's hard to pin them down.
We've seen how they navigated the tricky waters of cultural exchange, sometimes adapting to local customs, other times facing accusations of imposing their own values.
It's a tough balance.
And then there's that constant internal struggle, the tension between adapting to the changing world and staying true to their core doctrines.
It makes you realize that even within a religious order as seemingly unified as the Jesuits, there's a spectrum of thought and action, and that spectrum has shifted over time, responding to both internal debates and external pressures.
Right, like their involvement in liberation theology.
Oh, yeah.
That was a real turning point, wasn't it?
It was.
It brought to light those deep divisions within the Church about the role of social justice and the very meaning of the gospel message.
It did, and it's fascinating to see how those seeds of liberation theology, which caused so much controversy back then, are now reflected in Pope Francis's emphasis on economic inequality and environmental justice and the plight of migrants and refugees.
Right.
It shows how ideas once considered radical can eventually become part of the mainstream.
And it highlights that ongoing Jesuit tradition of pushing boundaries. Questioning assumptions, and engaging with the complexities of the world.
For sure.
Even if it means ruffling some feathers along the way.
It's almost as if their history is a constant dance between pushing outward into the world and then pulling back to re-examine their own core principles.
I see what you mean.
It's a dynamic process, and it explains why they've been able to remain relevant for nearly 500 years.
I think you've hit on something really important here.
What's that?
That ability to adapt, to reevaluate, to wrestle with those tough questions about faith, power, and the human condition.
It's not easy.
It's what makes them so fascinating to study.
Yeah.
They're not just a static historical artifact. They're a living, evolving entity, still shaping and being shaped by the world around them.
And their story offers valuable lessons for us today, regardless of our own religious beliefs or backgrounds.
In what way?
They challenge us to think critically about the role of institutions, the complexities of cultural exchange, and the responsibilities that come with power and influence.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, but it's important.
They remind us that history is never a simple narrative of good guys versus bad guys.
Right.
It's messy, it's contradictory, and it's full of unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
And it's precisely that messiness that makes it so compelling.
Exactly. And by grappling with the complexities of the Jesuit story, we can gain insights into the larger human story.
Okay.
The ongoing struggle to find meaning, purpose, and a just way of living in the world.
Now we invite you to consider this.
Okay.
What lessons can we draw from their experience?
That's a good question.
How can their story inspire us to think differently about our own role in the world and the challenges we face today?
We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and provided some food for thought.
Yeah.
The Jesuits, with their long and winding history,
It's a long one.
offer a unique lens through which to view the complexities of faith power and the human condition.
And while their story is far from over, we hope this exploration is giving you a better understanding of who they are, where they've been, and the enduring questions they raise about how we navigate the challenges of our own time.
Thank you for listening. If you love history, don't forget to subscribe to History with Bree and Peter. Join us for more fascinating stories from the past. Hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode.